Good morning, everyone. Welcome to MWise. And if you guys were not at our first session, my name is Mei Chang, and I am going to be your session facilitator for this room. So if you come back to this room today, later today, tomorrow, Wednesday, you're going to see a lot of me. So bear with me if some of my housekeeping items are a repeat. Before I introduce our speaker for this session, a couple of housekeeping items. If you haven't downloaded the MWise app on your mobile phone, please do so, especially because we encourage you all to, at the end of each session, to complete the speaker surveys. If you fill out 6 or more speaker surveys, you get a prize that you can claim on the expo floor. So you have to get 6 stamps to get that prize. The other housekeeping item is please remember that our keynotes start in the afternoon. So our keynotes will start at 2 o'clock today, and they are in Salon 5 and 6, which is just around the corner from this room. And yeah, I think that's it for housekeeping items. So let's begin. I'll introduce our speaker. Our speaker for the session is Matthew McWhort.
All right. Good morning, everybody, and thank you for joining the talk. Just make sure this is working. Maybe not. Oh. Okay, so my name is Matthew McWhort. I'm a managing director within Mandiant, now part of Google Cloud. I've been with Mandiant. Actually, tomorrow will be my 8-year anniversary, so 8 long years with Mandiant. But it's been a fantastic journey. I work within our security transformation services team, where we support clients both reactively during incident response, containment, eradication, remediation, and also taking those lessons learned and helping clients proactively by doing detailed security architecture reviews and digital transformation. And strong authentication is one of the common denominator security pillars, if you will, of where we are consistently helping our clients. It could be we're doing basic blocking and tackling during IR engagements to really level up some sort of weaker authentication mechanisms to maybe slow down or stop an attacker. Right, so we might be implementing some form of multi-factor authentication or device authentication or something to that extent. But oftentimes when we're doing detailed security reviews with clients, they want to know where are we and where do we need to be going in regards to authentication. So that is the whole purpose of this talk today. It's really some of the lessons learned that we see on the front lines of working with clients to level up their authentication strategies. And what are some of the pitfalls? What are some of the gotchas? And just for everyone's awareness, this is kind of based on some real life situations that we deal with on a pretty consistent basis with clients. So before we get started, I think it's very important for us to kind of understand where we came from many, many years ago. And unfortunately, some organizations are kind of still within this pillar. But if you think about 5, 6, maybe even going back a little bit further years ago, right? We kind of lived in our on-prem world where we had on-prem identities, we had our on-prem servers and applications and data. Right, and we slowly expanded that out, and we started to allow remote access and allow maybe vendors and guests to integrate within our ecosystem. But it was all within this vertical boundary of, think of it like a home, right? We had maybe multiple data centers and multiple locations, but it was a well-defined boundary that everyone was very comfortable with within the organization. They could actually probably draw it on a Visio or a piece of paper to say, here's my logically defined boundary. And think about like where we are now, or where a lot of organizations are moving to. We're moving from the vertical, where we used to scale up and down, to the horizontal, right? Because now we're no longer just on-prem, right? Most organizations have some sort of hybrid ecosystem and infrastructure, hybrid identities, our devices are mobilized, and our data is distributed on this horizontal plane, right? And it leaves some with a very uneasy feeling, right? Because they no longer have that defined boundary that they can feel comfortable with when it comes to authentication. If you think about it, the scope of where our identities authenticate has expanded horizontally, but the how has not necessarily done that. And the how is the core foundation of authentication. If you don't get that right, and if you're not actually leveling that up, it could be a very bad time for an organization. If you think about authentication strategies of the past, right? They do not scale and equate to what adversaries are doing today. So it really is important that organizations are starting to enhance what they're doing for authentication. And the new perimeter, right? That new boundary that a lot of organizations feel uncomfortable with because they can't really draw it out. Well, it's no longer like the physical element of a data center or firewall or that sort of thing. It is now the identity and your device. And the common glue that kind of binds these two together is authentication, right? So let's think about from the term authentication. What in the world does it mean? Actually, the definition of authentication has not changed over time, right? Authentication is essentially a means to verify the identity of could be a user, a device, a process, to access a resource, some sort of computing resource, could be an application, could be data. Everything that we used to do for authentication was a very singular transaction, right? It was someone providing username, password, maybe they had a certificate on their device, and that was it. There was a handshake, and then once that occurred, there was some sort of access granted. It could be an authorization was also part of that, but it was a very singular transaction. So what are some of the advances that we've seen most recently? And this is where we get into multi-factor authentication, right? So another level up, if you will, another component to help verify that the authentication process is legitimate. So it could be someone gets a code sent to a device. It could be somebody is verifying, and maybe they have an application on their device where they have to enter a one-time code. Or maybe they're doing some sort of phishing-resistant authentication where they're using FIDO2 or WebAuthn, right? But there has been advancement in this stage, so it's no longer just a singular transaction, right? It's multiple components that need to occur. So that's authentication. So there's another power up, right? There's another level up that organizations can do today, and that's the validate component. And this component is often overlooked. So if we think about what does this actually mean, right? With our identity providers today, we can actually do some of this validation. So we can look at the geo context of where this authentication request is being sourced from. Does it match anything historical? Does it match what we are expecting, right? We could have some identity attributes that we're looking at or identity level risk. So do we see multiple concurrent failed logons followed by a user getting some sort of access and modifying security attributes? Now they're authenticating from somewhere else. Maybe the identity is using a previously compromised password that has been identified in the wild, right? So this is actually taking the components of authentication, doing a level up to actually make sure that we're confidently providing the right identity access. And that's the whole point of validate. We can do session-based access, right? So we can actually determine within our IDP just how long of a session do we want to provide until we have that user revalidate. We could also be looking at attributes on a device to see, is the device healthy? Is the device actually registered to the identity that is authenticating? And with that, if we pass both the authenticate layer and the validate layer, we get some sort of token, right? We might get some sort of ticket. We could get a token, maybe it's a SAML token. So that can do authentication and authorization. It could be for OAuth, right? It could be a JSON web token. And then we could also get a claim if we're doing SAML and federation and things like that. So all of these can be part of what the user has provided that shows that they satisfy the authenticate and the validate stage. So this is where organizations are starting to move and where we want to see organizations leveling up how they authenticate users today. So this is kind of the ending of the movie I'm just going to give away. This is probably the most important slide. So the whole point of this talk is to really shift away from the singular, that single transactional nature of the authentication mechanism and go to the multiple components, right? So this is what can best provide that positive identity validation. And we get it from the authenticate piece that I just spoke about. And we can also get it from the validate piece. So this is very, very important. The term authenticators, I didn't make it up. We use it at Google. That's how Google refers to authentication today. NIST 863B, I think was one of the first publications I saw that actually started using this term. And instead of just doing authentication, we're trying to shift the mindset of using authenticators as the new terminology when we're thinking about authenticating identities. So let's also talk about passwords, right? Because this is where we came from. It's still an important part of what we do. I don't think we will ever totally get away from passwords. But these are just simple facts. I don't think any of these will alarm or shock anybody. At least they shouldn't. I hate passwords. You probably hate passwords. Your IT security staff and administrators hate passwords. But you know who loves passwords? Or cyber criminals and attackers, right? because stolen credentials are still one of the main points of entry that is used to access organizations today, right? So if we don't have some of these other guardrails that I just spoke about in place, it could be game over. It could be a very drastic impact for an organization around passwords. So we have seen some shifts, right, in recommendations throughout the years. This isn't new. This is actually going back a few years. And the industry is kind of, they want organizations to not just have passwords, so they're trying to relax some of those, some of the evangelization around that and some of the recommendations, really moving from passwords to passphrases, right? A lot of organizations will read this new, these recommendations that are coming out from NIST and Microsoft and others, and there's a lot of fine print buried in here, which I will talk about, that we would like for organizations to have in place before they would just read this and all of a sudden just go from having maybe 14, 15 character passwords to just 8 just because, the guidance or the recommendations say it. There's a lot of fine print buried in here that I want to talk through that we don't want organizations to shoot themselves in the foot by just blindly adopting some of this guidance without having proper controls in place. But it is happening, right? People are just annoyed with passwords. They want to get rid of them. But it's not going away. But you probably read about password lists, right? So password list is really where the identity and the device become one and the same, if you will. So password list is essentially built on PKI using asymmetric encryption with public and private key pairs. So unique key pairs are registered with the identity provider application. It's unique per registration, and it's usually stored on a device. It could be software, it could be hardware, but this is, when you hear about password lists, this is how it works. It's actually, if you think about how we used to authenticate using SSH and other methods, it's actually built on some of those same concepts and predicated on some of those same foundational elements. So there's a lot of memes out there about, what password is, what it isn't, but, it is important. It is a good trend. It is a good shift, but it's something a lot of organizations just aren't quite ready to do today. And it's something that some applications and architectures just don't support without a lot of investment and a lot of time and resources. So this is a very interesting graph. I didn't make up this data. Actually, it came from down at the bottom of the slide. But this actually shows, brute force based upon, the length and strength of a password and just how fast it can be done, right? So it's very important to understand that if you're like, you have a password strategy and you enforce password validation and strong complexity and things like that, and you're kind of in more the upper right quadrant of that graphic, and all of a sudden you read some of this new guidance coming out and you relax that, you could actually be going backwards without proper controls in place and really, introducing a lot of risk into your organization unless you have proper foundational elements. So it's very important just to kind of understand without guardrails what could happen. And granted, this graphic is just about brute forcing, right? I think we all know there are multiple ways that an adversary could obtain a password. It's not just brute forcing. There could be clear text passwords that could be stored in memory. It could be stored like in GitHub or different files that could be used, right? There's also pass the hash techniques where I don't even need to know what the full password is. It doesn't matter. I could phish a user. I could call a user. I could send them an SMS message, get them to enter their password into a form, and I now have it. So even if it's a 40-character password, I actually have what that value is. So this just represents brute force time. So this is not the only way that can be done, but it is something you just need to be mindful of if you are looking to relax some of your password guidance. And now we have AI, and I was told I had to have at least one AI slide in my presentation, so here it is, the last one that you will see me do. But with AI, all kidding aside, there have been advancements in cracking passwords and some of the mechanisms used to actually, what used to be maybe more manual processes or CPU-intensive processes, right? Some of that is now going to, obviously, we will see a lot of changes when it comes to AI going through this. So if we take some of that guidance, right, that we read about, and we kind of plot this on a graph, right? We have our password complexity and length and requirements on the left, and we have our level of privilege associated with our identities. And our identities are not just humans, behind a keyboard. It could be programmatic. There could be different types of identities we have, but this is just a very generalized view of it, where we're going to put our standard non-privileged interactive account. That's like our daily driver account that most users within an organization will leverage. We're going to put kind of our programmatic accounts that probably run a service. These could be privileged. These could be non-privileged. Then we're going to have our very highly privileged identities that could be used by administrators for managing systems, for automated workflows, and that sort of thing. So what we don't want to do is actually just increase that risk, right, by relaxing some of the password complexity and strength for our daily driver accounts. And if there is a direct line of sight for those accounts to actually interface with systems or other parts of the architecture where these other tiers of accounts are exposed, that could be game over. That could be a very bad situation. This is what we see adversaries do. So we need to focus on the must-have controls, which I will talk about here very, very shortly, to help minimize the risk of something happening for an organization to not shoot themselves in the foot by just going backwards just because they read a best practice somewhere. So it's also important to understand not all types of identities support strong authentication. It's just the reality of the situation, right? We have legacy applications, we have legacy architectures that have certain constraints and requirements that we just can't blow them away and just ignore them within our environment. So it is important to kind of understand what sort of accounts, if they don't support multi-factor, if they don't support some of these must-have controls and concepts, then we obviously want to try to get them to have a hardened password that's in the upper right quadrant of that graph, of that table I showed you, and also ensure that we're trying to rotate them, right, to minimize the exposure window if they were to be compromised. So these are just examples of different types of accounts that we commonly see within organizations where they kind of have to pump the brakes and realize everything we're looking at for strong authentication, some things are going to fall outside the realm of that. It's important to track that. It's okay that this happens, right? It's just it's the natural part of how we operate today, but it's very important that we're actually trying to align compensating controls and measures around these different types of identities because they could be the weakest part of the organization, and we don't want that to lead to a downstream impact for a compromise. Right. So I've been talking about the must-have controls. So what do these actually look like? What are we talking about? So this is some of the fine print that we at Mandiant are constantly educating our clients on. And this is what we look for in our security assessments when we do on-prem, we do cloud. These are the devil in the details type controls that can really elevate the security governance and posture of an organization. So there are kind of three categories that I put these in. It's more the normal identity-centric controls around privileged identities, and controls around your endpoint and devices, and some of the architecture elements kind of will be interwoven in between those three pillars, right? So identity, we obviously want to separate our privilege from our non-privileged identities. I think we hear this all the time, but reality is oftentimes we don't see this in the field, unfortunately. So it is something that organizations should be mindful of. Strong MFA enforcement. This is really key for external-facing services to start with. We oftentimes work with organizations that will have strong multi-factor authentication and strong controls around their VPN and their external-facing assets, but then they have legacy VPNs that were still set up, maybe for, it was like, if everything else breaks, we still have this way to get in, or maybe, yet we have this spin-off component that had to, still use this legacy VPN that's back here in the corner. We kind of ignore that. Oftentimes, if it's external-facing, someone's going to find it. And if you don't have strong controls around it, it could be like kind of a backdoor way into an organization. So it is important to kind of identify, understand what you have, and ensure that you are consistently trying to enforce strong authentication for all external access. Automated and banned password validation. So this is something a lot of IDPs, identity providers, incorporate today. Granted, it's not free. Oftentimes you have to pay additional licensing to get those components turned on. But it is very important that passwords are being checked against, exposure. Do they show up in password lists, or is there evidence of them in underground forums, that sort of thing. Active Directory, you can actually do this with plugins. There's DLLs you can run on a domain controller that can actually do this for you. But once again, it is a very important component here of ways that we're trying to push organizations to really enhance what they're doing. And identity and session risk, right? So we want to understand, what sort of patterns are we seeing from anomaly detection of authentication. We're seeing atypical travel, authentication attempts that appear to be very suspicious in nature, don't fall within what our expectations are. Having visibility into that and then using that as a lever to take action can actually go a very, very long way towards saving an organization, and at least being the initial point of compromise. So privileged and programmatic identities, right? This is from the on-prem perspective, we have tiering and Active Directory. Tiering is tier 0 through tier 2, where tier 0 are your most privileged assets. We're trying to push organizations. Tiering is good. Tiering relies upon user rights assignments, settings, and group policies being properly configured, and then pushed down everywhere, right? So you have to assume all the endpoints are going to get the the group policy updates, nothing's going to break. As we all know, if you've ever managed group policy, there's inheritance, there's blocking, there's all crazy ways that you might create a policy with good intent, but it actually never gets applied. So some of your tiering principles, some of your restrictions that you're trying to reduce the exposure of privileged accounts using tiering could break unexpectedly, and it could be just a false sense of security. So we're trying to get organizations to use authentication policy silos in Active Directory, and essentially these are containers in Active Directory with associated policies. These are centralized within AD. Doesn't rely upon something being pushed down to every endpoint. It's a more effective, centralized way to administer the scope of privileges and the exposure of privileged identities in on-prem AD. Account separation, as I already spoke about. We have just-in-time access. We want to use strong MFA where enforced. Now, oftentimes, MFA internally is a little different from MFA from the outside. Oftentimes, MFA internally is just for like RDP and other mechanisms, but if you try to do SMB or WMI or other connectivity methods, oftentimes those aren't under the umbrella of MFA enforcement. So you kind of want to understand and then maybe use the identity segmentation as a way to circumvent that. Oftentimes we find identity segmentation is a more effective control than network segmentation. If you can do it, when we get called in to help clients that are going through a ransomware or pre-ransomware event, the identity segmentation focus is pretty much where we start. You also want to, and this is something that's definitely come to light recently, is for virtualized infrastructure, for ESX, for your hypervisors, is try to unbind those from Active Directory as much as possible and create separate points of administration, separate identities that can actually administer those. Just because if there is a compromise of a privileged identity, oftentimes the ransomware groups are going directly to the virtualized infrastructure now using those previously compromised creds. If we can create some identity segmentation there, it's going to go a long way. So these are just some examples that we want to focus on. Endpoint protection, so there's kind of a lot here. But this is where we get into some of the user rights assignments that you can actually create your own version of tiering, if you will, using group policies. And I spoke about clear text credentials previously. We have wdigests, we have LM hash storage. I know these are all old terms, and you're probably like, why on earth are they in this slide? This is still something that we see quite commonly. Organizations, sometimes are still running 2008 R2 domain functional levels. So these things are not inherently disabled or turned off in many organizations. So it's very important that you actually take the time and effort to go through that. And really, this is all focused on kind of disabling and reducing the exposure of credentials as much as you can. So going back to that other graph where we had the different axis of identity in the line of sight, we want to take away all the ability, or as much of the ability as we can for that to happen. And this is essentially how you do it on-prem. So from the cloud side, right? A lot of the on-prem terminologies and statements I just made are still important. But obviously, we want to enforce. You think about from the cloud, right? We have a greater exposure. We have a greater attack surface just by the way, the nature of the way cloud is by default, unless you go in and start, tweaking things. So we definitely want our strong MFA. I think that the important takeaway here, I'm not going to read every bullet, and I have a slide coming up that'll kind of articulate this probably a little better than I will verbally. But if you think about from the cloud, right? It's not just if you detect a compromised identity, go disable their account. There's still session lifetimes, there's still tokens, there's persistent, non-persistent, browser cookies that might be stored on a device. There's other ways. So even if you take that action in your IDP and disable the account, right, that session could still be active for 4 to 8 more hours that the adversary is going to be able to ride that and maybe then compromise additional resources within the environment. So it's definitely important to have playbooks around that, and I have a slide that will talk through that. And same with the privilege side as well, trying to move away from the static, long-lived keys that we have, service accounts, that sort of thing. From on-prem, we can do that with managed service accounts, where Active Directory can actually do that rotation every 30 days with crazy 128-character passwords that you'll never know the actual password to. We also have managed service identities in Azure, and we have workload identities. And really just kind of moving to that shorter lifetime of an identity within the cloud as much as we possibly can. So I'm going to talk a little bit about multi-factor authentication. So this is a slide. I spoke at MWise last year, plagiarizing myself because I used the same slide last year. But I do think it's important to kind of highlight that not all multi-factor is created equal, right? So obviously no MFA is not good whatsoever. So on the bottom, we have the cost and the administration. Cost could be from the organizational perspective. It could also be from the adversary perspective. And then we have the level of protection that we get from the different methods of MFA that are out there today, right? So we have some of our more insecure methods. So we have like the SMS, the email-based, the phone call. These might still be effective. Maybe they're basic blocking and tackling that we have to do, but they can be defeated by an adversary, and we'll see that here in a little bit. We have MFA thresholds and limits that we can do, right? So we can maybe try to slow down the attacker by limiting the amount of attempts that they can make within a certain time frame. But in all honesty, this is probably going to frustrate more users than it will an attacker. So we don't really see a lot of organizations getting value here. But it is a lever that you have to pull if needed. And this is where we kind of get into some of the more ways you can provide contextualization to the user. And this is a very important advancement really over the past 2 years that we've seen. A lot of companies, Microsoft, Duo, Okta, and other IDPs now support some sort of number verification. So it's not just blindly clicking an accept or yes, but you actually have to enter that number. And oftentimes it's now coupled with the geo, like where is this request originating from? I know in the past I used to get pop-ups on my device many years ago, and I had no idea. I was like, is this something I did? Is this something somebody's trying to phish me? I had no clue because there wasn't contextualization. And now we can start to get that. And this really helps our users. This can be a great way to actually, obviously, prevent something bad, but it could be an initial indicator, right, that they might want to call the service desk or help desk to report. But over here is where we get into the FIDO2. This is what is when you hear phishing-resistant MFA, WebAuthn. All those good things come with your YubiKeys and your devices, your OATH tokens, which is different from OAuth. I think I said this last year, but OATH is for authentication, where OAuth is authorization, so a little bit different. And then you can also combine that with cert-based auth with some of these other levers that you can pull to really go for that strong MFA. But understand, right, this has a cost. Right? It's going to be painful for our adversaries, but it could also be painful for our organization to manage FIDO2 keys everywhere, and how do we distribute those? What if someone loses their key, and what backup methods are we going to provide? So you need to understand the processes that go into this, and this isn't something that organizations will sometimes do overnight. This will take a little bit more time. So typically they're in that upper left quadrant to start is where we try to at least aim for a good starting point. This is the same graph, right? Just putting a different spin on it. So, and understanding like, okay, well, that looked good, but what are the realistic attack methods that, if I'm not doing this, that could happen to me? So obviously, if we're not doing MFA, all kinds of bad things, could certainly happen there. But, when we go up to some of those other insecure methods, obviously there's SIM swapping, there's other techniques, there's interception, there's MFA fatigue, right, where users will just get spammed to death, and that's what adversaries do to annoy them, and so they eventually just click yes to make it go away, and then maybe that was an attacker trying to get into an environment. And then we have some of the more contextualized methods, still susceptible to bad things, right? So there's adversary in the middle, where essentially there is a proxy of some sort that an attacker has control of. They will send a phishing message or an SMS message, get the user to click on it, and they will actually terminate the session and then forward it on to the legit service for authentication at the very end. Once username, password, MFA has been satisfied, they will actually intercept the token and then use the post-authentication token or session to gain access. So this definitely happens. So it is something to be mindful of. Really, the only way to truly defeat that is the phishing-resistant MFA methods, where it really comes down to the physical aspect of somebody would actually have to take your key from you and then try to leverage it. And then if you couple that with some of the bio controls and your devices with Windows Hello and other things, it becomes even harder method for an adversary. I mean, their costs goes way up. So where do you prioritize? This slide represents very common questions we ask during incident response remediation and also investigations to understand just what is the exposure? What is the impact of a customer might call us and say they found evidence their credentials were leaked on the web. What does this mean for them, right? Is it single factor everywhere? So these are some of the areas that we focus on. I'm not going to read them all off for the sake of time, but it is important to understand where your weak points are and then prioritize your authentication strategies around that. This is very difficult now because organizations are in a state of change, right? Some of them might be moving to a centralized IDP or a cloud-based IDP, and they're synchronizing identities from multiple stores. Maybe they have multiple AD domains and trusts. So they might be in a different state, for a different part of the business for each of these. It's very important to have a PM or a dedicated team that's tracking and helping just keep all this organized and focused. And, oops. Okay, so let's define our journey. What does this look like on a blank slate of how we can actually make this a reality, right? So let's just start, we want to go from the singular nature of authentication to a more robust strategy. So we're just going to put our different tiers of accounts, and we're going to kind of rank those where our most sensitive accounts are going to be at the bottom, right? Those should have the least exposure, right? Those should be the most protected accounts within our organization. And then the daily driver accounts that will probably have the most exposure that are used, in all kinds of places are going to be at the top. And then we're going to look at, what are some of the common authentication methods we see today? And, what are, if an organization is looking to level up or go to the, the next stage to enhance their authentication, what does that actually look like for them, right? So just, standard accounts, most oftentimes we see username, password. Sometimes we see a passphrase, but, oftentimes not. And maybe some organizations are going to passwordless, but haven't really seen that at scale yet. So obviously, as we spoke about, we want to go to that phishing-resistant MFA. These are the accounts that are going to have the most exposure, probably the largest attack surface, if you will. Might not have the greatest impact if an attacker were to compromise one of these, but once again, if they have line of sight to other identities, it could be a very bad situation. For the programmatic side, we want to move away from those long-lived keys and certificates that never expire, that are just out there, especially with API and other methods that organizations are using for authentication today. And we want to try to use IAM binding policies and further, and associated roles and policies with that. Managed service identities, on-prem and cloud, are now supported with a lot of identity providers, and it is something to definitely take a look at. And we're just kind of building, right? As we go through the different tiers, we want to start to go to that just-in-time, check-in, check-out methodology of short-lived credentials, short-lived sessions, and maybe even a multi-approval, multi-admin process for someone to elevate to that role or to gain access to that account. And same holds true for tier 0. We've kind of just kept adding as we go, right? That's obviously makes sense. We want to have the most rigid set of defenses and processes around those identities, but that's kind of where organizations should be looking to go to some extent. All right. So now that we've determined where we want to go, right? We've got some sort of roadmap. We've got to understand, like, okay, well, this looks good, but does our IDP actually support all this? Are we actually able to do this with what we have, or is this going to require investment? Is this going to require, how many more people do I need? How many contractors? How many, armies of resources am I going to need? That's definitely something you need to understand, and understand the realities of what your budget constraints are and how can you actually make this work. Also, you want to understand the self-service requirements and capabilities. How are your end users going to actually be part of this experience? What sort of pains are they going to go through? And how is our help desk and service desk going to help validate the identities of these individuals? And we'll talk through that here in a second. We also want to understand, does our IDP actually support some of these processes of identity risk management and understanding, was there previously suspicious activity correlated previously, and now that identity is trying to do something else? Is that something where we need to actually take some sort of action, or at least have note of that in the event something nefarious happens? And then we want to understand, once someone authenticates, okay, how much longer until we make them re-authenticate? Is that 4 hours? Is that 30 days, 60 days? What is it? And the perfect consulting answer is, it depends, and it certainly does. So these are all the different elements that can go into a session lifetime, right? There's a lot of different attributes. IDPs now, at least some of the more modern ones, support. You can actually go in and start tinkering with all these crazy things and come up with different lifetimes based upon all these different factors. And it's going to differentiate per organization, per what the identity, what the device is attempting to access, right? But here are just some of the factors that can come into play here, especially when it comes to the target resource side. I think that's where we kind of will push organizations to understand, do you have a categorization of what are your most critical and important systems within your environment? And probably those you want to enforce, maybe that's going to require, a very shorter lifetime, because in the event that there is a compromised device or identity, you don't want someone to piggyback on an existing session to get to like HR data or that sort of thing. So, sorry about that. If we put this, I think this is the last crazy scale I have. So we have our identity types at the bottom, and then we have the target resource on the left. And understanding, okay, well, what does this look like from a session lifetime perspective? So we're going to put in some times, and we're going to, we will rank them based upon the shorter the lifespan is at the top, and the longer, the session duration is at the bottom. And let's just say we're starting with a device that's fully managed by our MDM. It's passed all health checks. It's compliant. It has all the checks. We've got no EDR alerts. Everything looks good. This looks normalized. It's coming from a trusted location with with IP addressing that correlates to a location maybe that's on-prem. It's using a client non-browser-based application. So we might actually, and it's accessing a resource which is not, it's not too sensitive in nature. So we might have that session be valid for 7 days before we would allow or at least require the user to re-authenticate. But understand, there is fluctuation here. If that same device is going to access my HR application to go in and update, their phone number, or maybe it's, maybe this is your IDP where there's self-registration and I can register a new MFA device for my new iPhone 15 that I just got or something like that, then obviously we want to have, there will be fluctuations. It's not going to be one size fits all. So depending upon the target resource, that's going to drive just, what sort of duration. And if there is session risk identified, right? If we have SOAR, if we have some of our integration, that could actually contribute to that fluctuation of if we detect something suspicious, we probably want to try to kill all sessions and have the user or the device re-authenticate and revalidate. Take that to the opposite, where we have an unmanaged device, right? This could be like someone's home computer, untrusted location, they're traveling on vacation, they open up a web browser, and they're trying to log into Workday or something like that, right? So obviously something like that, we want to make the time as short as possible because of the cookie and just the nature of browser-based applications. We don't want someone else to come along and be able to maybe piggyback off that existing session or steal that cookie and replay it in some manner, which unfortunately happens, right? And then we have over here, highly privileged roles. I think at least in my opinion, these time factors go away, right? If you're in a highly privileged role doing something, you don't want that to be open for 7 days where that identity has to re-authenticate. We want to go back to the concept of just-in-time, strong auth, our managed devices, and our trusted locations. OK, so got 7 minutes left. This is a playbook I put together. I had to do this for a client, and I was just trying to articulate, and I think it really did resonate, that back in the day, if there was an identity compromise, somebody would go in Active Directory and disable the account or reset the password, and then they would investigate and try to figure out what on earth happened. That's no longer the case with cloud, right? Just going to your IDP is one thing, but you might actually have, so from the on-prem side, right, we might have, we have our Active Directory, or maybe we've integrated with another IDP. We might have apps that aren't part of single sign-on, aren't part of that IDP that user has an identity associated with, that we actually have to go in and manually then revoke within. Maybe there's older legacy applications that are very sensitive. This is all about just building playbooks and having processes in place, understanding that it's no longer just about checking the disable account, reset password box. There's all sorts of different factors. There's token, refresh and persistent tokens all have different values. We can actually go in, like in Azure Intra, and use the Graph API. We might have to kill sessions that way. All kinds of things, browser-based. Then our external partners and vendors, maybe we have control over their identities. Maybe we don't. Maybe we've federated, or we've created some sort of trust with them, right? So then we have to get them on the phone to kind of understand what can they do on their end. So having these processes built out is going to be huge. Same holds true for remote access, for your multi-cloud. Registered devices gets a little bit, it gets a little interesting there, because if you're using passwordless, right, all those keys are stored somewhere, most likely on a device of some sort. So what if, that user, are you going to go and disable the device if it's registered with the IDP? Yeah, you can probably do that. What if the attacker actually registered their own device? Because we had, we allow maybe just device registration in Active Directory. It's every user, I think, can register up to 5 devices by default, and we haven't locked that down. So maybe there's other devices we actually have to take a look at than just the one that we think is associated with the identity. API keys, right, oftentimes aren't really part of our IDP. Maybe they are, but oftentimes this is a separate step, right? So it's a separate playbook. It's a separate process. And then app credentials is certainly one that's not really the IDP. you're going to be able to revoke. So this is if you have maybe an application bound that can read mail, that can do things within your organization, and an attacker associates a password for legacy authentication that'll bypass MFA. Unless you go investigate and remove that capability, you could reset the accounts all day long, every hour, and they're still going to get in via that method. So it's very important to understand the full scope of what you have and what types of identities are now present. So this slide has taken on new meaning here probably in the past week or so. It definitely is important to understand how your users or how your help desk or service desk is going to be able to positively validate and verify who they are talking to on the other end, right? So as part of onboarding, you may want to have, where it's required mandatory video session of, someone needing to hold up an identification to actually show that they are the person that they are claiming to be. This is super important, especially onboarding, even post-onboarding, for very sensitive roles within an organization, highly privileged identities and accounts. You want to make sure that, I don't know if your entire help desk needs the ability to be able to blindly reset a password for an admin. You may want to have that multi-admin approval or a different tier of people that can actually do that, or a reduced focus. Allow employees to understand when attributes about what they've registered changes, right? When there are changes in the IDP, that all of a sudden there's a new device added, or there's a device removed, or some attribute changes. Make sure that that's part of a notification process. And last but not least, have playbooks where you can test this process. Sometimes it might be time to go into a shields up mode where there is a suspected compromise or an adversary that uses effective social engineering to try to create that trust relationship within an organization to gain that initial access to do bad things. So it really is important that there are solid processes around this. And train your help desk staff. It's okay to say no, right? It's okay to say, I'm not going to be able to do this right now. We'll have to call you back. And until you can have these processes in place, sometimes no is the correct and the safest answer. So wrap up here. I've got 3 minutes. It really is leadership. You need to get the executive leadership. You need to get the buy-in for where the organization wants to go. That's first and foremost. Without that, the whole strategy of trying to level up your authentication can go nowhere. But it is very important to get that buy-in and go through those requirements that we talked about. Understand the types of identities that you have. Where are you today in the one column? Where do you want to be? And then understand, okay, well, what from the where we want to be side, what is actually supported with the technologies and the processes we have today. And it's not just about buying a new technology or onboarding with a new identity provider. There's processes that are part of this. You obviously want to try to get some buy-in from the user communities. This is probably going to be a lot of pushback because different groups are going to have different opinions on, well, my app isn't going to support this. If we try to add MFA here, it's going to break this and that. So understand where the strategy might not be able to be enforced 100%, and build in those must-have controls and those compensating measures to minimize the risks within the organization. And obviously, most organizations that do this, they might call it identity transformation or digital transformation, but really what they're doing is they're going through transitions. They're starting in one place, so maybe they just have singular passwords today. They want to go to contextual MFA, so that's transition 1. Then once they get everyone there, they feel like they're in a better place. Then they want to go to FIDO2. They want to do the phishing resistant. That's transition 2. So think about the transitions as the quick wins where you can actually show progress rather than just looking at it from the whole transformational picture of something that's a 3-year journey. People are going to start asking, well, why haven't we done anything? If we haven't broken it down into those achievable goals, right, that can be the pump the brakes moment that someone in leadership says, we're just going to stop this. This doesn't seem to be worth our time. So break it down into realistic expectations of how you can actually do this. Test with a small component of your identities, devices, and applications. See what works, what doesn't work before this gets rolled out to the masses. And really it is about testing, training, educating the users about what to expect and what their experience will be like. I think we all know this is not one size fits all. You have to find the right balance for your organization, right? So just understand what the risks are, understand what your threat model is from what adversaries are doing to target, like identities in similar organizations, and build your processes around that. Last but not least, this slide shows this can be done, right? And a lot of people are obviously probably using one of these 3 cloud providers. But there are methods, and some of this might even be outdated from when I put it together a month or 2 ago, because there's continual controls and new functionality being introduced. So, some of the core authentication goals that we have there on the right, you can kind of see with the different cloud service providers what you can actually do to, help move the dial there. So yeah, I think I've got 20 seconds left, and that was the last slide. So I'm happy to hang out for any questions, because I think we have to clear the room. But I appreciate everyone coming out this morning, and hope everyone has a great time at the conference. Thank you.